A millionaire threw his own mother out on the street. Months later, he was shocked by the letter he received. The glass and steel tower pierced the San Francisco skyline like a gleaming sword, its 50 stories reaching toward the clouds as if trying to touch heaven itself. On the top floor, Michael Thompson stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his office, his reflection superimposed on the cityscape below. At 35, he cut an impressive figure in his tailored charcoal suit, but the slight shadows under his eyes betrayed the weight of responsibility he carried. His phone buzzed for the 1,000th time that day. Another congratulatory message about TechVision's latest acquisition, a promising AI startup that would add another $1 billion to his company's valuation. Michael allowed himself a small smile, remembering how far he'd come from the cramped 2-bedroom apartment in the Mission District where he grew up. The sound of high heels clicking against marble flooring drew his attention. His executive assistant, Rebecca, appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand. "Mr. Thompson, the board members are waiting in the conference room for your presentation." Michael nodded, adjusting his tie. "Thank you, Rebecca. And my mother's gift?" "Delivered this morning, sir." The roses should have arrived at the mansion by now. He checked his watch, a vintage Patek Philippe that had belonged to his father. The same watch that had been pawned and repurchased countless times during his childhood to pay for school supplies, medical bills, and eventually the computer parts he needed to build his first prototype. Now, it served as a constant reminder of where he came from and what it had taken to get here. As he gathered his presentation materials, his mind wandered to the upcoming weekend. His mother, Sarah, had been insisting he take a break from work to visit her at the mansion where he'd installed her 5 years ago. She claimed to have exciting news to share, but Michael had been postponing the visit, buried under the avalanche of responsibilities that came with running a tech empire. The board meeting proceeded like clockwork. Michael presented the acquisition details with the confidence of someone who had turned a bedroom coding project into a multi-billion-dollar company. The board members nodded approvingly as he outlined his vision for integrating the AI technology into their existing platforms. Later that evening, as the California sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Michael found himself alone in his office again. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out an old photograph, creased and worn at the edges. In it, a younger version of himself stood between his parents at his high school graduation. His father, James Thompson, beamed with pride, one arm around Michael's shoulders. He was wearing the same watch that now adorned Michael's wrist. The memory of that day was still vivid. His mother had sewn her own dress for the occasion, working late into the night after her regular seamstress jobs. His father had taken an extra shift at the factory to buy Michael a new tie. They hadn't had much, but they'd given him everything they could. His phone rang, displaying his mother's number. Michael hesitated before answering. "Mom." "Michael, sweetheart." Sarah's voice carried its usual warmth, but there was something else, an excitement he hadn't heard in years. "I really need to see you this weekend. It's important." He ran a hand through his dark hair, guilt gnawing at him. "Mom, I'm sorry, but the merger—" "Michael James Thompson," she interrupted, using his full name like she used to when he was a teenager. "You've been saying that for weeks now. Some things are more important than work. Your father always said, 'Dad's not here anymore.'" Michael cut in, more sharply than he'd intended. The silence that followed made him regret his words immediately. "No, he's not," Sarah said softly. "But he would want you to live, not just work. Please, come to dinner this Saturday. There's someone I want you to meet." Someone. The word caught him off guard. In the 5 years since his father's passing, his mother had never mentioned meeting anyone. The thought made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite explain. "I'll be there," he found himself saying, almost against his will. "Saturday at 7? Perfect." The joy in her voice was unmistakable. "And Michael?" "Wear something casual. This isn't a business meeting." After hanging up, Michael returned to the window, watching as lights began to twinkle across the city. His empire was visible from here. The billboards displaying his company's logo, the stores selling his technology, the buildings housing his employees. He had achieved everything he'd ever dreamed of, everything his parents had sacrificed for. Yet standing in his perfectly tailored suit, in his perfectly appointed office, At the top of his perfectly designed building, Michael Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The city below him sparkled like a bed of stars, but somewhere in those lights was the modest mansion where his mother lived alone, preparing to share news that he already suspected would shake the carefully constructed order of his world. He touched his father's watch, a habit he'd developed whenever he felt uncertain. The smooth metal was cool against his fingers, a tangible link to a past that seemed simultaneously like yesterday and a lifetime ago. Whatever his mother's news was, he owed it to her, to both his parents, to be there and listen. As night fell over San Francisco, Michael finally left his office, his mind already racing with possibilities about what Saturday might bring. The weight of his father's watch felt heavier than usual on his wrist, like a reminder of promises made and kept, and perhaps of others yet to be tested. Sarah Thompson stood in front of the antique mirror in her bedroom, smoothing down the silk blouse she had chosen for the evening. The mansion her son had bought her was beautiful, filled with every luxury she could imagine, but sometimes she missed the cozy chaos of their old apartment, where the smell of fabric and the whir of her sewing machine had filled the air. Her hands instinctively moved to the silver locket around her neck, James's last gift to her before his heart condition took him away. Inside was a family photo from Michael's college graduation. She opened it now, touching the image gently. "Oh, James," she whispered, "I hope you'd understand." The doorbell's melodious chime echoed through the house. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, and she caught herself smoothing her hair one last time. At 55, she had kept her natural color, the silver strands mixed with dark brown, giving her an elegant appearance that David said made her look like a classic movie star. David Anderson. Even thinking his name brought a smile to her face. She hurried down the curved staircase, her footsteps light despite her age. When she opened the door, there he stood, looking distinguished in his tweed jacket, a bouquet of wildflowers in his hands. "I know roses are more traditional," he said, his eyes twinkling behind wire-rimmed glasses. "But these reminded me of that poem we discussed in class last week, the one about finding unexpected beauty in simple things." Sarah took the flowers, inhaling their fresh scent. "Frost would approve," she said, referencing their shared love of poetry. It had been their first connection point at the community center's craft and literature workshop 5 months ago. In the kitchen, as she arranged the flowers in a crystal vase, one of Michael's many generous gifts, David leaned against the counter, watching her with undisguised admiration. "Have you told him yet?" he asked gently. Sarah's hands stilled on the stems. "He's coming for dinner on Saturday," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've barely seen him these past few months. He's always so busy with the company." David moved closer, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, he's your son. Yes, he'll be surprised, but he loves you. And this," he gestured to her still flat stomach, "this is a miracle. Our miracle." She turned to face him, tears threatening to spill. "He was so young when James passed. Sometimes I think he's still that 20-year-old boy, trying to prove himself to a father who's no longer here. The company, the money, the mansion, it's all part of that." David pulled her into a gentle embrace. At 60, he had the quiet confidence of a man who had spent his life sharing his passion for literature with young minds. His gray hair and kind eyes gave him a trustworthy appearance that had first drawn Sarah to him. But it was his soul, his genuine appreciation for life's quiet moments and deep emotions, that had made her fall in love. "Remember that passage from Love in the Time of Cholera we discussed in class?" he asked, his voice soft against her hair. "About how love was always love, in whatever time or place." Sarah nodded, smiling despite her worry. Their relationship had begun over such literary discussions. She had joined the community center's workshop, hoping to find a hobby, something to fill the lonely evenings in her too large house. Instead, she had found a man who could quote Pablo Neruda over coffee and discuss Jane Austen with genuine enthusiasm. Their romance had developed slowly, carefully. Weekend poetry readings had turned into long walks through the park. Discussions about books had evolved into conversations about life, love, and loss. David had shared stories about his years teaching, His divorce 2 decades ago, his decision never to have children, until now. "I keep thinking about what James said in his last letter," Sarah confided, moving to sit at the kitchen island. David followed, taking her hand in his. "He wrote that he wanted me to find happiness again, that love shouldn't end with him." "Your James was a wise man," David replied, squeezing her hand. "And Michael has his father's heart, even if he's buried it under spreadsheets and stock options." Sarah laughed softly, remembering how James used to say their son had inherited his determination and her creativity, a combination that had proved unstoppable. The app that had launched Michael's empire had been coded on a second-hand laptop at their kitchen table, with Sarah's sewing machine providing background music as she worked to pay for his college classes. "I'm not ashamed," she said firmly, placing a hand on her stomach. "Of us, of this baby. I wish I knew how to make Michael understand that this isn't about replacing his father. It's about living the life James wanted for me." David stood, pulling her up into another embrace. "Then that's what we'll tell him. Together." He stepped back, his eyes twinkling with sudden mischief. "Though perhaps we should wait until after the poetry reading to drop both bombshells, that his mother is not only in love, but also expecting a miracle baby." Sarah laughed, the sound echoing through the kitchen. It was a sound that had been rare in this house until David had entered her life. The mansion had always felt too big, too quiet, too much like a museum of her son's success rather than a home. But lately, with David's frequent visits, it had begun to feel alive again. As they prepared dinner together, moving around the kitchen in comfortable synchronization, Sarah found herself imagining a future she hadn't dared dream of. The sound of a child's laughter filling these halls again, family dinners that weren't dominated by business talk, holidays that felt warm and real rather than perfectly orchestrated events. The baby, though unexpected at her age, felt like a gift, a second chance at family, at joy, at love. Now she just had to hope that Michael, with his rigid views on tradition and family, could understand that his mother's happiness didn't diminish his father's memory. Looking at David as he carefully stirred the pasta sauce, his grandmother's recipe he'd proudly declared, Sarah touched her locket again. This time, instead of grief, she felt hope. Saturday would change everything, for better or worse. But for now, in this moment, she allowed herself to simply be happy, surrounded by the scent of wildflowers and the promise of new beginnings. The grandfather clock in the foyer, another of Michael's elaborate gifts, struck 7 just as the security system announced his arrival. Sarah watched through the window as his Tesla smoothly pulled into the circular driveway. Her son emerged looking decidedly not casual in dress slacks and a blue cashmere sweater that probably cost more than she used to make in a month of sewing. "Mom?" His voice echoed through the foyer. "Something smells amazing." Sarah took a deep breath, unconsciously touching her locket before going to greet him. Michael stood in the entrance, a bottle of expensive wine in one hand and a leather briefcase in the other. Always prepared for business, even at a family dinner. "Sweetheart." She embraced him, holding on perhaps a moment too long. "I'm so glad you came. And you almost managed casual," she teased, trying to lighten the mood. Michael gave her a boyish grin that reminded her so much of James, it made her heart ache. "This is casual. I left the tie at the office." He followed her to the kitchen where the table was already set for 2. "So, who's this mystery person you wanted me to meet? Don't tell me you hired a personal chef." "I can recommend several if—" "Let's have dinner first," Sarah interrupted, taking the wine. "Tell me about your week. How's Claire?" The mention of his wife seemed to relax him slightly. "She's good. In New York for a medical conference. She sends her love." He settled into his usual chair at the head of the table, James's old spot. "The merger's going well. We're expanding into artificial intelligence, which could revolutionize how we—" Sarah listened as she served dinner, letting her son's corporate achievements wash over her. She noticed how he kept checking his phone, though he tried to be discreet about it. The Michael who had once spent hours tinkering with computers at their kitchen table, sharing his dreams with her, seemed very far away. "Mom?" His voice brought her back to the present. "You're quiet tonight. Is everything okay?" Sarah placed her fork down carefully. Michael, do you remember what your father used to say about happiness? How it was like a garden that needed tending? A shadow crossed his face at the mention of James. Dad said a lot of things about happiness. He also worked 60-hour weeks at the factory to provide for us. Yes, he did. Sarah reached across the table to touch her son's hand. And he wanted us to be happy. He told me that, right before... She paused, gathering her courage. In fact, he wrote me a letter about it. Michael's hand tensed under hers. A letter? You never mentioned a letter. There's a lot we haven't talked about, sweetheart. About grief. About moving forward. She withdrew her hand slowly. About finding love again. The word love hung in the air between them like a suspended moment before a storm. Michael's face remained perfectly still, but she saw his jaw tighten, a tell he'd had since childhood. Mom, he said carefully, what exactly are you trying to tell me? Sarah straightened in her chair, channeling the strength that had carried her through years of poverty and loss. His name is David Anderson. He's a literature professor at City College. We met at the community center 5 months ago, and we've been seeing each other since then. Michael stood up so abruptly, his chair scraped against the hardwood floor. Seeing each other? What does that mean exactly? It means we're in love, Michael. The words came out clearer than she'd expected. He's a wonderful man. If you'd just meet him. Meet him? Michael's laugh was harsh. Why would I want to meet the man who's taking advantage of my mother? Taking advantage? Sarah felt heat rise to her face. I'm 55 years old, Michael, not some naive girl. David is a respected professor, a kind and intelligent man who's probably after your money, my money. He began pacing, his carefully cultivated corporate calm cracking. Did you even think about that? About what people will say? About what this would do to Dad's memory? Sarah stood now too, her voice shaking but firm. Your father wanted me to be happy. He said so in his letter. He knew that love doesn't end with loss. It just... Stop. Michael slammed his hand on the table, making the crystal glasses jump. Just stop. I don't want to hear about this. This affair. It's not an affair, Sarah said quietly. It's more than that. Much more. She touched her stomach unconsciously, and Michael's eyes followed the movement. His face went pale. No, he whispered. Then louder. No, tell me you're not... I'm pregnant, Michael. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. David and I are having a baby. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah watched as her son's face transformed, moving through shock to disbelief to something she had never seen directed at her before. Fury. Have you lost your mind? His voice was low, dangerous. You're 55 years old. Do you have any idea how ridiculous this is? How embarrassing? What were you thinking? I was thinking about love, Sarah replied, her own anger rising. About joy, about second chances. Second chances? Michael laughed bitterly. Is that what you call this betrayal? Betrayal? Sarah felt tears stinging her eyes but refused to let them fall. Your father has been gone for 5 years, Michael. 5 years, he wouldn't want me to spend the rest of my life alone. So instead, you're going to play house with some professor, have his baby, turn yourself into the talk of San Francisco society? He ran his hands through his hair, disrupting its perfect style. I won't allow it. Sarah felt her breath catch. Allow it? You don't get to allow or disallow anything in my life, Michael. I'm your mother, not your employee. No, but this is my house. His voice was cold now, controlled. And I won't have you turning it into a love nest with your professor. He spat the word like it was dirty. You have a choice to make, Mom. End this nonsense now, all of it, or find somewhere else to live. Sarah stared at her son, this stranger in expensive clothes who looked so much like James, but had none of his compassion. She thought of David, waiting at home, probably grading papers and worrying about her. She thought of the baby growing inside her, a miracle she hadn't expected, but now couldn't imagine living without. Her voice was steady when she spoke. Then I'll pack my things. Michael's face showed the first crack in his armor, surprise, followed quickly by uncertainty. He clearly hadn't expected her to choose love over luxury. "Mum, be reasonable." "I am being reasonable," she interrupted. "I'm choosing life, Michael. I'm choosing love. Just like your father wanted me to." She moved toward the stairs, then turned back one last time. "When you're ready to talk, really talk, call me. Until then, goodbye, sweetheart." She climbed the stairs slowly, her hand on the banister James had once built, leaving her son standing in the dining room amid the ruins of what should have been a joyous family dinner. David's apartment in the heart of North Beach was everything the mansion wasn't: small, lived in, and bursting with character. Books lined every available wall space, their well-worn spines creating a patchwork of colors and memories. The morning sun streamed through the bay windows, casting warm patterns on the hardwood floors where Sarah's single suitcase now stood. "We can convert my study into a nursery," David said, carrying in a box of her photo albums. "It has the best natural light, and the window seat would be perfect for late-night feedings." Sarah ran her hand along a shelf of poetry books, smiling at the organized chaos of David's filing system, Shakespeare next to Silverstein, Frost mingling with Ferlinghetti. "Are you sure you're ready for this? Your peaceful professor's life is about to change dramatically." David set down the box and wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hand resting protectively over her stomach. "My peaceful professor's life was missing something until you walked into that community center." He kissed her temple. "Both of you are worth every change." The sound of a car horn from the street below filtered through the windows, mixing with the distant clang of cable cars and the aroma of fresh bread from the Italian bakery downstairs. It was so different from the carefully manicured silence of the mansion's gated community, yet Sarah felt more at home here than she had in years. Her phone buzzed. Claire, Michael's wife, calling for the third time that morning. Sarah let it go to voicemail, not ready yet to explain everything to her daughter-in-law. She had left a note for Michael before leaving the mansion, along with James's last letter, hoping that perhaps his father's words would reach him where hers had failed. "I should start unpacking," she said, moving toward her suitcase. Inside were the essentials she'd grabbed in her hasty departure: clothes, photographs, her sewing kit, and the few pieces of jewelry that held sentimental value rather than monetary worth. David watched her from the doorway, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I've been thinking about the baby's education fund. I have some savings, and with my pension—" "David, stop." Sarah crossed the room to cup his face in her hands. "We'll figure it out together. I didn't leave that mansion for your money." He smiled, covering her hands with his. "No, you left it for my extensive collection of first editions and my ability to quote romantic poetry at inappropriate moments." Their laughter was interrupted by a knock at the door. They exchanged glances. It was too early for their usual Sunday visitors from the faculty. David went to answer while Sarah continued unpacking, trying to ignore the flutter of anxiety in her stomach. "Sarah?" David's voice carried a note of surprise. "It's Claire." Sarah turned to find her daughter-in-law standing in the apartment's entrance, looking somewhat out of place in her designer outfit and perfect makeup. Claire's eyes were red-rimmed, suggesting she'd been crying. "I'm sorry to drop by unannounced," Claire said, wringing her hands. "I got your address from the community center. I needed to see you." Sarah gestured for her to come in, shooting a questioning look at David, who nodded in understanding. "I'll go pick up some fresh bread from downstairs," he said, grabbing his keys. "Take your time." Once they were alone, Claire sank onto the worn leather sofa, her composure cracking. "Michael's a wreck," she blurted out. "He hasn't slept, hasn't eaten. He just sits in his office, staring at that watch of his father's." Sarah sat beside her, fighting the maternal instinct to rush to her son's side. "He made his choice, Claire. He made it in anger," Claire argued, then hesitated. "There's something you should know. I'm pregnant too." The words hung in the air between them. Sarah felt her heart constrict with both joy and sadness. Joy for the grandchild she would have. Sadness that this moment of sharing was happening here, in these circumstances. "We found out last week," Claire continued, wiping her eyes. "I was waiting for the right moment to tell him. And then all this happened. He's so wrapped up in his pain that he can't see straight. When I told him this morning, do you know what he said? He said he couldn't bring a child into a world where everything he believed in was falling apart. Sarah reached for Claire's hand, squeezing it gently. Oh, sweetheart. Michael has always seen the world in black and white, just like his father used to before. Before what? Sarah stood, moving to the box of photo albums. She pulled out a worn envelope, James's letter. Before he wrote this, I left it for Michael last night, but knowing him, he probably hasn't opened it yet. It's about love, Sarah said softly. About how it grows and changes, but never really ends. James wrote it when he first learned about his heart condition. He made me promise not to read it until after he was gone, and not to share it until the right moment. She touched her stomach gently. I think this is that moment. Like a good man, Sarah supplied with a small smile. Like someone who makes you happy, Claire finished. I haven't seen you smile like this since before James. The two women embraced, and Sarah felt tears threatening again. Hormones, she told herself firmly. When they pulled apart, Claire's hand lingered on Sarah's arm. Take care of yourself, Claire said. Both of you. And Sarah, congratulations. On everything. After Claire left, Sarah stood at the window, watching her daughter-in-law's elegant figure disappear into a waiting town car. David returned moments later, the scent of fresh bread filling the apartment. Everything okay? He asked, setting the bread on the kitchen counter. Sarah turned to him, taking in his concerned expression, the reading glasses perched on his head, the flour dust on his tweed jacket from the bakery. This was her life now. Smaller in square footage, perhaps, but somehow larger in every way that mattered. It will be, she said, and for the first time since leaving the mansion, she truly believed it. Michael sat in his darkened office, the San Francisco skyline twinkling beyond the windows like a constellation of earthbound stars. His father's watch lay on the desk before him, alongside the unopened letter and a glass of scotch he'd been nursing for hours. Claire's news about the baby should have thrilled him. It was everything they'd been hoping for. But instead, it had cracked something inside him, letting loose a flood of emotions he couldn't control. The envelope mocked him from the desk, his mother's elegant handwriting spelling out, "From your father," across the front. He'd been carrying it around for 3 days, unable to open it, unable to throw it away. Now, with the office empty and his phone finally silent, he reached for it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the hospital's watermark visible in the corner. Michael recognized his father's distinctive handwriting immediately. My dear Sarah, if you're reading this, it means my heart finally gave out. The doctors say it could be tomorrow or 10 years from now, but I needed to write this while I still can. There are things that need to be said, not just to you, but to our son as well. Sarah, my love, you've given me a life filled with more joy than I deserved. From the moment we met at that diner where you worked double shifts to pay for college, to watching you turn our tiny apartment into a home with nothing but love and determination. You've shown me what true strength looks like. But I need you to promise me something. Promise that you won't let my memory become a chain that holds you back. Love isn't meant to be a cage. It's meant to set us free. Whether it's a month from now or a decade, when you find someone who makes your heart beat faster again, don't let guilt stop you. You have too much love to give to keep it locked away. And Michael, my son, my pride, my greatest achievement, if you're reading this, I need you to understand something. Success isn't measured in dollars or square footage. It's measured in moments of joy, in lives touched, in love shared. You've always been so much like me, stubborn, proud, determined to prove yourself. But don't make my mistake. Don't wait until your heart starts failing to realize that life is meant to be lived, not just achieved. Take care of each other. But more importantly, let yourselves be happy. That's all I've ever wanted for both of you. All my love, James. The letter slipped from Michael's fingers, landing softly on his desk. He reached for his phone with shaking hands, scrolling to his mother's number. Just as he was about to press dial, it rang, Claire's name flashing on the screen. Michael! Her voice was panicked. You need to come to UCSF Medical Center right now. It's your mother. There are complications with the pregnancy. She's been admitted to the high-risk unit. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. What? What happened? Professor Anderson called me when they wouldn't let him in. Something about next of kin protocols. She's asking for you, Michael. She needs you. He was already grabbing his keys, his father's letter crushed in his fist. I'm on my way. The drive to the hospital was a blur of traffic lights and horns, his father's words echoing in his head. Don't wait until your heart starts failing to realize that life is meant to be lived. The same heart condition that had taken his father. Could it affect his mother's pregnancy? The thought made his chest constrict with fear. When he arrived at the hospital, he found David Anderson pacing the waiting room, his usually neat appearance disheveled, his glasses slightly askew. The sight of him, this man his mother had chosen, this man who clearly loved her, hit Michael differently now. Mr. Thompson, David said, his voice rough with worry. Thank you for coming. They won't tell me anything because I'm not family. But she's been having severe pain and her blood pressure. Michael cut him off by walking straight to the nurse's station. I'm Michael Thompson. My mother, Sarah Thompson, was admitted earlier. The nurse looked up from her computer. Yes, she's in room 507. The doctor is with her now. Are you her next of kin? I am. Michael glanced back at David, who had sunk into a chair, head in his hands. Making a decision that surprised even himself, he added, and that's David Anderson, her partner. He should be added to her approved visitors list. The nurse nodded, making a note in the system. Follow me, please. Both of you. As they walked down the sterile hallway, Michael felt the weight of his father's watch on his wrist. But for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a reminder of love, of family, of choices that could still be made. They found Sarah propped up in bed, monitors beeping steadily around her. She looked small against the white hospital sheets, but her eyes lit up when she saw them both enter together. My boys, she whispered, reaching out her hands to them. Michael moved to one side of the bed, David to the other, each taking one of her hands. The gesture felt natural, as if they'd been doing it for years rather than seconds. Mom, Michael started, his voice catching. I read Dad's letter. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. And? Before he could answer, the doctor entered, chart in hand. Mrs. Thompson, we have your test results. She looked at the two men. Would you like to discuss this privately? Sarah squeezed both their hands. No, she said firmly. My family stays. The word family hung in the air, and Michael felt something shift inside him, like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known was there. Whatever news was coming, they would face it together, just as his father would have wanted. The doctor's words seemed to echo in the sterile hospital room. Mrs. Thompson, you're experiencing pregnancy-induced hypertension, which is putting significant stress on your heart. Given your age and family history, we need to monitor you very carefully over the next few weeks. Michael felt his mother's hand tighten in his. On the other side of the bed, David had gone pale, his professor's eloquence deserting him entirely. The baby? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. The doctor consulted her chart. Currently stable, but we're concerned about potential complications. I'm recommending complete bed rest for the remainder of your pregnancy, with weekly, possibly daily, monitoring here at the hospital. Daily monitoring? David spoke up, his voice rough. But our apartment is across town, and with my teaching schedule, she can stay at my place, Michael said, surprising everyone, including himself. I have a guest suite on the ground floor of my house in Pacific Heights. It's 10 minutes from here, and I can have a medical team on call 24/7. Sarah looked at her son, tears welling in her eyes. Michael, and Professor Anderson, Michael continued, forcing himself to meet David's startled gaze. There's a study adjacent to the suite. You could grade papers there, prepare your lectures, stay close. The silence that followed was broken only by the steady beeping of monitors. David adjusted his glasses, clearly moved. That's very generous of you, Mr. Thompson. Michael, he corrected quietly. I think you should call me Michael. The doctor smiled, making notes in her chart. That sounds like an excellent arrangement. Mrs. Thompson needs constant support right now, both emotional and physical. The more stable and stress-free her environment, the better her chances for a healthy, full-term pregnancy. After the doctor left, Sarah looked between the two men in her life, the son who had her determination and the partner who had helped her rediscover joy. "Are you sure about this?" she asked Michael. "Both of us. In your home?" Michael pulled up a chair, still holding his mother's hand. "Dad's letter. He wrote about not waiting until it's too late to understand what matters. About not letting pride get in the way of love." He took a deep breath. "I've been doing exactly what he warned against, measuring everything in achievements and appearances, forgetting what he really wanted for us." "Which was?" David asked softly. "Happiness," Michael replied, touching his father's watch. "Just happiness." Sarah reached for David's hand with her free one, creating a circle of connection around the hospital bed. "Your father would be so proud of you right now," she told Michael. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Claire stood in the doorway, still in her medical conference attire, looking worried. "I got here as soon as I could. Is everything okay?" Michael stood to embrace his wife, drawing her into their circle. "Mom's going to need special care. She and David are moving into our guest suite to help my daughter-in-law through her pregnancy while she helps me through mine," Sarah finished, smiling through her tears. "I can't think of anything I'd want more." David cleared his throat. "Well, as the only person in this room who hasn't either been pregnant or written a best-selling app, I volunteer to handle all late-night cravings runs for everyone." The laughter that followed felt like a release valve, letting out weeks of tension. Michael found himself studying David's profile, the kind eyes behind the wire-rimmed glasses, the way he looked at Sarah like she was poetry come to life. This was the man his mother had chosen, the man who would help raise his sibling, the man who had brought light back into her eyes. "Professor David," Michael corrected himself. "What do you teach, exactly?" "American literature, primarily. Though this semester I'm teaching a special seminar on second chances in classical literature." His eyes twinkled. "Life imitating art, it seems." "I have a few thoughts," David replied, his entire face lighting up. "Have you ever read Goodnight Moon? It's a masterpiece of metaphor and—" As David launched into an enthusiastic analysis of children's literature, with Claire asking thoughtful questions, Michael watched his mother's face. She was glowing, despite the hospital pallor and worry lines, as she looked between her son and her partner. This, he realized, was what his father had wanted. Not just happiness, but family, in all its messy, unexpected, beautiful forms. "We'll need to convert the study upstairs into a nursery too," Michael found himself saying. "For when the babies, are older. Maybe you could help with that, Mom. Your eye for design was always better than mine." Sarah's smile was like sunrise. "I'd love that. And maybe we could put a sewing corner in there? I've been thinking about making baby quilts, with classic literature quotes embroidered on them," David added enthusiastically. "I have some perfect passages in mind." As his mother and David began planning literary-themed baby quilts, with Claire adding medical-themed suggestions that made everyone laugh, Michael felt something settle in his chest. The weight he'd been carrying since his father's passing seemed lighter somehow, transformed from a burden into a foundation, something to build upon rather than be crushed beneath. Outside the hospital window, San Francisco's fog was rolling in, softening the city's edges. But in this room, everything was becoming clearer by the minute. The guest suite at Michael's Pacific Heights home had transformed over the past 2 weeks. What was once a sterile, magazine-worthy space now breathed with life and personality. David's books occupied an entire wall, their worn spines creating a tapestry of literary history. Sarah's sewing machine hummed quietly in the corner, surrounded by swatches of soft fabrics in gentle pastels. Medical equipment blended discreetly into the background, a necessary but unobtrusive reminder of why they were all there. Michael found himself lingering longer in the mornings before heading to the office, drawn by the aroma of David's carefully brewed coffee and his mother's whole-grain toast. This particular morning, he paused in the doorway, taking in the scene before him. Sarah sat at the breakfast nook, her growing belly now visible under her favorite silk robe, while David read aloud from his weathered copy of Little Women. Claire, fighting her own first-trimester nausea, was curled up on the window seat, sipping ginger tea and listening intently. Christmas won't be Christmas without any presents, David read, his professor's voice giving weight to the familiar words. He glanced up, catching Michael in the doorway. Ah, perfect timing. I was just about to make another pot of coffee. I can do that, Michael offered, moving toward the kitchen with newfound familiarity. 2 weeks ago, he wouldn't have known where anything was in this part of his own house. Now he knew exactly which cabinet held David's preferred coffee beans and which drawer contained his mother's special honey spoon. "How are you feeling this morning?" he asked Claire, measuring out the coffee beans. "Better, now that Sarah taught me her morning sickness tea recipe." Claire smiled at her mother-in-law. "Though I still don't know how you're managing to sew with all this fatigue." Sarah looked up from the tiny quilt square she was embroidering. "This little project keeps me sane during bed rest. Besides, these babies need their literary quilts." The quiet domesticity of the moment struck Michael suddenly. Here they all were, sharing space and stories, creating something new together. The house that had once echoed with emptiness now hummed with life. "Michael," Sarah called softly, "would you like to feel your sister kick? She's particularly active this morning." He hesitated only briefly before crossing the room and placing his hand where his mother indicated. The slight flutter under his palm made his breath catch. "Remarkable, isn't it?" David said, watching them with gentle eyes. "Every time I feel it, I'm reminded of that Whitman quote, 'I am large, I contain multitudes.' Trust you to turn a kick into a poetry lesson," Sarah teased, but her eyes shone with affection. The moment was interrupted by Michael's phone buzzing. Another crisis at the office, no doubt. But before he could check it, Claire spoke up. "You know, I was thinking, there's this old Italian tradition of Sunday family dinner. Given that none of us are Italian, we could start our own tradition. Maybe Saturday brunches? When both babies are born, it would be nice to have that routine established." Michael looked at his wife with surprise and gratitude. In the midst of morning sickness and her busy medical career, she was thinking about family traditions, about the future. "I could make my mother's challah," David offered. "She always said breaking bread together was the foundation of family. And I could teach you both my secret recipe for that morning sickness tea," Sarah added. "You'll need it for when you have patients with similar struggles, Claire." Michael found himself nodding. "I could work less on Saturdays," he said slowly, as if testing out the words. The idea would have seemed impossible a month ago. Now, it felt right. The baby kicked again under his hand as if in agreement. "Your father would have loved this," Sarah said softly, covering Michael's hand with her own. "He always wanted our home to be full of life and laughter. Even if that life includes a literature professor who can't help turning every moment into a teaching opportunity," David asked, his eyes twinkling. "Especially then," Michael surprised himself by saying. "Dad was always saying I needed to read more than just computer manuals." The laughter that followed was warm and genuine. Michael's phone buzzed again, but this time he didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, he sat down at the breakfast nook, poured himself a cup of coffee and asked, "So, what happens next in Little Women?" David's face lit up as he found his place in the book again. Claire moved from the window seat to join them at the table, her hand unconsciously resting on her own barely visible bump. Sarah continued her embroidery, the gentle click of her needle keeping time with David's words. Outside, San Francisco was waking up, fog rolling back to reveal another pristine autumn day. But inside this room, something more precious was unfolding, the careful, delicate art of becoming a family. "Christmas won't be Christmas without any presents," David began again. But this time, Michael understood that the real present was this, the simple gift of being together, of choosing love over pride, of learning that family wasn't about perfect appearances but perfect acceptance. His father's watch ticked softly on his wrist, marking not just time passing but time being lived, fully and completely, just as James had wanted for them all. The emergency alert came at 3:47 a.m., shattering the pre-dawn quiet of Michael's home. Sarah's blood pressure had spiked dangerously high, triggering the medical monitoring system installed in the guest suite. Michael reached the bottom of the stairs just as David was helping his mother into a wheelchair, both still in their nightclothes. "The ambulance is 4 minutes out," Claire announced, already in doctor mode despite her own pregnancy fatigue. She had her medical bag open, checking Sarah's vitals with practiced efficiency. "I'm fine," Sarah insisted weakly, though her pale face and trembling hands told a different story. "The baby just got a little excited, that's all." David knelt beside the wheelchair, still in his rumpled tweed pajamas, a gift from Sarah that had made everyone laugh at the time. Now, his professor's composure was nowhere to be seen as he clutched Sarah's hand. "Save your strength, my love. Remember what Hemingway said about being strong in all the broken places? Now is not the time for literary references, David." Sarah managed a weak smile, then winced. The paramedics arrived with practiced urgency, their questions precise and professional. As they loaded Sarah into the ambulance, Michael found himself frozen, watching the scene as if from a distance. It was too familiar. Another late night, another ambulance, another parent's life hanging in the balance. "Go with them." Claire's voice cut through his paralysis. "David and I will follow in the car. She needs you, Michael." The ambulance ride was a blur of beeping monitors and quiet prayers. Sarah kept her eyes closed, focusing on her breathing as the paramedics had instructed, while Michael held her hand. He found himself checking his father's watch compulsively, marking each minute that passed. Each minute, his mother's heart continued beating. "Talk to me," Sarah whispered between controlled breaths. "Distract me." Michael swallowed hard. "Did I ever tell you about the night I finished coding my first app? The one that started everything?" Sarah shook her head slightly. "You were working late at the seamstress shop and Dad was doing overtime at the factory. I was alone in our apartment debugging until my eyes hurt. When I finally got it working, I ran all the way to the factory to show Dad. I remember." Sarah's voice was faint but present. "He called me at work, so proud he could barely speak. What I never told you was what he said to me that night after you got home. He took off his watch, this watch, and said he'd been waiting for the right moment to pass it down." Michael's voice caught. "He said time was the most precious thing we had, and we had to make every second count." The ambulance turned sharply, and Sarah grimaced. "Your father was always better at the big life lessons than I was." "No, Mom. You taught me just as much. You showed me what it means to love unconditionally, to put family first. He squeezed her hand. "I forgot for a while." They arrived at the hospital to find Dr. Chen, Sarah's high-risk pregnancy specialist, already waiting. "Let's get her stabilized," she ordered. And suddenly Sarah was being whisked away, leaving Michael standing in the emergency room entrance. David and Claire arrived moments later, slightly disheveled but focused. Claire immediately went to consult with the medical team, her professional status giving her access that would normally be restricted. David joined Michael in the waiting room, both men equally lost without something to do. "She was reading Jane Eyre before bed," David said suddenly, his voice rough. "She always reads a few pages before sleeping."
"Said it reminds her of studying for her English finals while pregnant with you." Michael looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since the emergency began. The professor's usual scholarly confidence was gone, replaced by the raw fear of a man who had found love late in life and couldn't bear to lose it.
"She's going to be okay," Michael said, surprising himself with his certainty. "She's the strongest person I know." David nodded, removing his glasses to wipe them compulsively. "Did you know she's been working on a special project? Between the bed rest and the medical monitoring, she's been embroidering a family tree quilt. Not just names and dates, but little symbols for each person. A book for me, a computer for you, a caduceus for Claire." "What did she choose for herself?" Michael asked softly. "A heart," David smiled sadly. "Said it represented both love and strength. Rather fitting, don't you think?" Before Michael could respond, Claire appeared in the waiting room doorway. Both men stood immediately. "She's stable," Claire announced, and Michael felt his knees go weak with relief. "Dr. Chen has her on medication to control the blood pressure, but..." She hesitated. "But what?" David's voice was barely a whisper. "They're recommending complete hospital bed rest for the remainder of the pregnancy. The next few weeks are crucial. One parent can stay with her overnight, but she needs absolute calm. No stress, no excitement." Michael and David exchanged glances. "You should stay," they said simultaneously, then stared at each other in surprise. I have morning classes, David started. I have board meetings, Michael said at the same time. A nurse appeared then, gesturing that they could visit. They found Sarah propped up in bed, looking exhausted but alert, her hands resting protectively over her belly. My 3 worried faces, she said softly. Come here where I can see you properly. They gathered around her bed, David on one side, Michael and Claire on the other, forming a protective circle of love and concern. The baby's fine, Sarah assured them before they could ask. Just giving us all a good scare to make sure we're paying attention. Like mother, like daughter. Michael attempted a joke, his voice still shaky. Sarah reached for both David's and Michael's hands. I'm not going anywhere, she promised. This little one and I just need some extra care. And maybe, she glanced at Claire with a twinkle in her eye, some company during those long hospital days. I think we can arrange that. Claire smiled, touching her own growing bump. After all, your future grandbaby needs story time with Grandma. The first rays of dawn were beginning to peek through the hospital window, painting the room in soft gold. Michael's father's watch showed 6:15 a.m., less than 3 hours since the emergency began, though it felt like a lifetime. Time, Michael realized, was indeed precious. But it wasn't just about making every second count. It was about who you counted those seconds with. The hospital room had been transformed over the past week. David's collection of classic novels created a miniature library on the windowsill, while Michael had installed a state-of-the-art tablet system that allowed Sarah to video chat with her prenatal yoga instructor. Colorful quilting squares were spread across her bed, each one telling a piece of their family story through carefully chosen fabrics and threads. It was Michael's turn for the night shift, and he sat in the surprisingly comfortable recliner he'd had delivered, going through quarterly reports on his laptop. Sarah was sleeping peacefully, the monitors showing stable vital signs. The quiet beeping had become a reassuring rhythm, a mechanical lullaby confirming that both his mother and unborn sister were safe. The door opened quietly, and David slipped in, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the artisanal cafe down the street. Thought you might need this, he whispered, offering one to Michael. It's not quite as good as my home-roasted beans, but it beats the cafeteria brew. Thanks. Michael accepted the cup, noting how David immediately went to check Sarah's quilting progress from earlier that day. She finished the square about your first date today. Something about poetry in the park? David's face softened at the memory. I was giving a public reading of Pablo Neruda's works. Sarah was the only one who stayed through the rain shower. She said the weather made the poetry more authentic. Michael found himself smiling. That sounds like Mom. Did I tell you about the time she sat through my entire high school coding competition? 6 hours of watching teenagers debug software, and she acted like it was the most fascinating thing she'd ever seen. She has a gift for that, David agreed, settling into the other chair. For making people feel seen. Important. He paused, adjusting his glasses. It's what drew me to her, you know. Not her beauty, though she's radiant, but her capacity to find wonder in everything. Even a boring literature professor's ramblings about metaphors. You're not boring, Michael said automatically, surprising them both. I mean, Claire's been reading that book you recommended about parenthood through the lens of classical literature. She says it's helping her process everything better than any of the medical texts. David beamed with scholarly pride. Ah, the Odyssey of Parenthood. Wonderful choice. You know, there's a chapter about fathers and sons that reminded me of your relationship with James. He trailed off, clearly worried he'd overstepped, but Michael leaned forward. Tell me about it. As David launched into an enthusiastic explanation of Greek mythology and its parallels to modern family dynamics, Michael found himself genuinely engaged. The professor had a way of making centuries-old stories feel immediately relevant, personal even. Their discussion was interrupted by a small sound from Sarah. Both men were instantly alert, but she was just shifting in her sleep, one hand protectively cradling her belly. She does that a lot, David observed softly. Even in sleep, she's protecting both of them. Like she always protected me, Michael nodded. You know, after Dad, after we lost him, she worked 3 jobs to keep me in college. Never complained, never asked me to quit. Just kept going, kept believing in me. She believes in love, David said simply. in all its forms. He hesitated, then reached into his worn leather messenger bag. "I've been wanting to show you something, but the timing never seemed right." He pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a vintage ring, elegant but understated, with a delicate pattern of leaves wrapped around a modest diamond. "It was my grandmother's," David explained. "I've been carrying it around for weeks, waiting for the right moment to ask Sarah. But then all this happened, and I didn't want to add any stress." He closed the box carefully. "I know it's not the kind of ring a billionaire's mother might expect." "It's perfect," Michael interrupted. "It's exactly what she would love. Simple, meaningful, with a story behind it." David looked at him hopefully. "Then you wouldn't object to making this official?" Michael studied the professor. This man who read poetry in the rain, who could quote Shakespearean sonnets from memory, who looked at his mother like she was the most precious first edition in existence. "Dad's letter," Michael said slowly, "talked about love being meant to set us free. I think he would have liked you, David. You don't try to change her or protect her from life. You just love her, exactly as she is." "That's the easiest thing in the world," David replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Loving Sarah is like breathing. Natural, necessary, life-giving." Sarah stirred again, this time opening her eyes. "Are my two favorite worriers plotting something?" she asked sleepily. David quickly tucked the ring box away as Michael stood to adjust her pillows. "Just discussing the philosophical implications of modern technology on classical literature," he said smoothly. Sarah smiled knowingly. "And here I thought I heard something about rings and love being like breathing." Both men froze, then looked at each other, then burst into quiet laughter. "How long have you been awake?" David asked, taking her hand. "Long enough to know that my son and my love are finally becoming friends," she said contentedly. "Now, if one of you would be kind enough to get me some ice chips, I believe I have a quilting square to finish. Something about a future proposal scene I've been planning." Michael stood, squeezing his mother's shoulder gently. "I'll get them. David can tell you about the fascinating parallel he just drew between startup culture and Homer's Odyssey." As he walked to the ice machine, Michael found himself smiling. His father's watch showed 3:15 a.m., traditionally the darkest hour of the night. But in room 507, light was growing, not just from the subtle glow of medical monitors, but from the warm illumination of family bonds strengthening, of new connections forming, of love expanding to embrace change rather than resist it. When he returned with the ice chips, he found David reading aloud from Jane Eyre, while Sarah worked on her quilting. The scene was so peaceful, so right, that Michael pulled out his phone and quietly took a picture. Some moments deserved to be preserved, to be added to the family story they were all writing together, one day at a time. The autumn sunset painted room 507 in shades of amber and gold, filtering through the various flower arrangements that had accumulated over the past 3 weeks. Sarah's hospital stay had turned the sterile space into something approaching a home, with quilting projects, classic novels, and family photos creating a tapestry of love and hope. "Romeo and Juliet might be a bit heavy for a newborn," Claire laughed, holding up one that read, "Star-Crossed Baby." "But A Midsummer Night's Dream is perfect," Sarah replied, gesturing to her favorite, which featured tiny fairy wings on the back. "Though I still think Michael's contribution takes the prize." They both looked at the tech-themed onesie hanging in a place of honor. "Already smarter than my brother's first algorithm." The door opened and Michael entered, followed by David. Both men looked suspiciously well-dressed for a regular hospital visit. Michael in a tailored suit that wasn't his usual business attire. David in a new tweed jacket that Sarah had only seen in the shopping bag. "What's the occasion?" Sarah asked, her eyes twinkling. "Did someone win a Nobel Prize for literature?" "Not quite," David replied, his voice unusually nervous. He glanced at Michael, who nodded encouragingly. "Actually," Michael said, straightening his father's watch on his wrist, "I think I should stay for this." Sarah looked between the three of them, her hand unconsciously moving to her belly. "Now you're all making me nervous. Is everything okay?" "Everything is perfect," David assured her, moving to sit on the edge of her bed. He took her hand in his, and Sarah noticed his fingers were trembling slightly. "My dear, wonderful Sarah, Do you remember the first poem I ever read to you? Pablo Neruda's Sonnet 17, she answered immediately. I love you without knowing how, or when, or from where. I love you straightforwardly, without complexities or pride, David continued, his professor's voice rich with emotion. So I love you because I know no other way than this, where I does not exist, nor you. So close that your hand on my chest is my hand, so close that your eyes close as I fall asleep. Michael moved to stand by the window, his presence supportive but unobtrusive. Claire wiped a tear from her eye, one hand resting on her own growing bump. When I first read those words to our literature group, David continued, I had no idea that poetry would lead me to the greatest love story of my life. Sarah Thompson, you've taught me that it's never too late for new chapters, that love doesn't follow a conventional narrative structure, and that the most beautiful stories are often the ones we least expect. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the vintage ring box. Sarah's eyes widened as he carefully opened it. This ring belonged to my grandmother, a woman who believed that love was life's greatest adventure. She wore it through 63 years of marriage, through wars and peace, through hardship and joy. Before she passed, she made me promise to give it only to someone who made my soul sing with the same harmony she and my grandfather shared. David slipped off the edge of the bed and, despite his artificial knee that usually protested such movements, got down on one knee beside her. Sarah, my love, my unexpected miracle, will you marry me? Will you let me spend whatever chapters we have left writing our story together? Sarah's tears flowed freely now, but her smile was radiant. She looked past David to Michael, a mother's instinct needing to check one last time. Michael stepped forward, touching his father's watch. Dad wrote that love sets us free, he said softly. David's love for you, Mom. It's exactly what Dad wanted for you. What I want for you, too. Sarah turned back to David, who still knelt patiently, hope shining in his eyes behind his scholarly glasses. Yes, she whispered. Yes to every chapter, every verse, every line of poetry you want to share. David's hands shook as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the vintage design catching the last rays of sunset and throwing tiny rainbows across the hospital walls. I think your sister approves, she told Michael, then pulled David up to sit beside her again. Our little literary critic is already expressing her opinion. Speaking of opinions, David said, reaching into his bag, I have something else for both of you. He pulled out a book, a leather-bound collection of love poetry. I've been annotating this since the day we met, Sarah, adding notes about how each poem reminded me of you, of us. And Michael, he turned to his future stepson, I added your father's letter, because his words about love and family are the most beautiful poetry of all. Michael stepped forward to take the book, running his fingers over the worn leather. Dad would have loved this, he said quietly. He always said actions speak louder than words, but sometimes the right words can change everything. The right words at the right time, David agreed, can build bridges between hearts. Sarah touched her engagement ring, then her locket with James's photo, then reached for both Michael's and David's hands. My past and my future, she said softly, all connected by love. The baby kicked again, as if adding her own exclamation point to the moment. In the peaceful quiet that followed, they could hear the steady beating of multiple hearts, monitored, living, and growing, all in perfect harmony. The call came at dawn, just as San Francisco's fog was beginning to lift. Michael had been in the middle of an important video conference with Tokyo when Claire burst into his home office, her face flushed with excitement. It's time, she said, and those two words sent Michael's world spinning. He ended the call mid-sentence, already reaching for his keys. The hospital corridor was a blur of motion when they arrived. David was there, pacing nervously, his usually pristine tweed jacket rumpled from a night of anxious waiting. The doctors say everything's proceeding normally, he reported, pushing his glasses up his nose for the 100th time. But her blood pressure. I'll check with the medical team, Claire assured them, her own pregnancy now showing prominently beneath her doctor's coat. She disappeared through the delivery room doors, leaving Michael and David to their shared vigil. Michael found himself touching his father's watch, a habit that had become more comfort than compulsion these days. "Dad was in Tokyo when Mom went into labor with me," he said quietly. "He missed my birth by 3 hours." David stopped pacing to look at him. "Sarah told me. She said it was one of his biggest regrets. He made up for it, though." Michael smiled at the memory. "Never missed a single important moment after that. Science fairs, graduation, my first investor meeting. He was always there. And now you're here," David said softly, breaking the cycle, being present. The delivery room doors swung open and Claire emerged, her face serious but her eyes bright. "Sarah's asking for both of you. The baby's coming and—" She hesitated. "There are some concerns about her blood pressure. She needs her family around her." They followed Claire through the doors, properly gowned and masked. Sarah lay in the delivery bed, monitors beeping steadily around her. Despite the obvious strain, she smiled when she saw them. "My boys," she whispered, reaching out both hands. "Come closer. Your sister's eager to meet you." Michael took one hand, David the other. The next hours were a blur of medical terms, encouraging words and shared strength. Sarah's grip would tighten occasionally, and both men would find themselves holding their breath until each contraction passed. "Tell me a story," Sarah requested during a particularly difficult moment. "Something happy." David, his professor's eloquence momentarily deserting him, looked helplessly at Michael. "I have one," Michael said, surprising himself. "It's about a boy who thought success meant tall buildings and billion-dollar valuations. He was so focused on building his empire that he forgot what his father had taught him about building a family." He squeezed his mother's hand gently. Then life gave him a second chance, in the form of a literature professor who quoted poetry in the rain, and a baby sister who wasn't even born yet but already knew how to bring people together. "Don't forget the part about the strong-willed mother," Sarah added through gritted teeth, who knew her son's heart was bigger than his pride. "And the part about love setting us free," David contributed, his voice thick with emotion. The monitor's beeping suddenly increased, and Dr. Chen stepped in. "It's time, Sarah. Are you ready to meet your daughter?" The next few minutes were intense, filled with encouragement and effort. Sarah's grip on both men's hands was iron strong, her determination palpable. Then, suddenly, a new sound filled the room. The strong, healthy cry of a newborn baby. "She's perfect, Doctor," Chen announced, lifting the tiny bundle. "Strong, vital signs, excellent color." As the medical team worked quickly to clean and check the baby, Sarah's monitors began to stabilize. Claire, who had been watching the readings anxiously, finally relaxed. "Everything's normalizing," she reported with relief. "Both mother and daughter are doing great." When they placed the baby in Sarah's arms, time seemed to stand still. She was tiny but perfect, with a dusting of dark hair and eyes that, when they briefly opened, showed hints of the Thompson blue. "Hello, little one," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We've been waiting for you." David leaned in, his scholarly composure completely abandoned as he gently touched his daughter's tiny hand. "She's miraculous," he breathed. "Michael," Sarah called softly, "would you like to hold your sister?" With trembling hands, Michael accepted the small bundle. The baby looked up at him with unfocused eyes, and something in his chest expanded almost painfully. "Hi there," he said softly. "I'm your big brother. I'm going to teach you all about computers and algorithms. But don't worry, your dad will make sure you learn some poetry too." "Speaking of which," David said, his voice still shaky with emotion, "we never did decide on a name." Sarah smiled tiredly. "I think we did. We just didn't know it yet." She looked at Michael meaningfully. "What do you think about hope?" Michael looked down at his sister, then at his father's watch, then back at his mother and David. "Hope," he repeated softly. "Because that's what she gave all of us, isn't it? Hope for new beginnings. Hope for healing. Hope for family." "Hope Thompson Anderson," David tried out the name, beaming with pride. "Actually," Michael said, "what about Hope James Thompson Anderson? To honor Dad?" Sarah's eyes filled with fresh tears as she nodded. David reached out to squeeze Michael's shoulder. their shared love for Sarah and now for Hope creating a bond neither had expected but both now treasured. Outside the window, the sun had fully risen, burning away the last of the fog to reveal a crystal-clear San Francisco day. In the distance, the Tech Vision Tower caught the morning light, its windows blazing gold. But Michael wasn't looking at his empire anymore. His world had shifted axis, centering now on this hospital room, on this moment, on this tiny person who had already brought so much healing to their family. Hope yawned in his arms, her small face scrunching up in an expression that was pure Sarah. Love, Michael realized, really did have infinite space to grow. It didn't divide when shared between more people. It multiplied, creating new connections, building bridges, healing old wounds. 1 year later, the Thompson-Anderson family gathered in the garden of Michael's Pacific Heights home. The space had been transformed for Hope's first birthday celebration, with fairy lights twinkling in the early evening air and literary quotes printed on elegant banners that fluttered in the breeze. Sarah sat in the center of it all, Hope bouncing on her lap, while she watched Claire chase after 3-month-old James, who had already mastered the art of rolling away during diaper changes. The two babies, born just 9 months apart, had brought more joy to the family than anyone could have imagined. "Need help?" Michael asked his wife, scooping up his son with practiced ease. "You know, for a future neurosurgeon, he's remarkably skilled at escape artistry." "Like father, like son," Sarah commented, adjusting Hope's party dress, a handmade creation featuring delicately embroidered passages from children's classics. "I seem to remember someone else who never wanted to stay still during changes." David emerged from the house carrying a cake that perfectly embodied their blended family, one half decorated with binary code and frosting, the other half featuring edible pages from Goodnight Moon. "The bakery thought we were crazy," he chuckled, "but I think it's rather perfect." "Speaking of perfect," Michael Lau said, bouncing James on his hip, "I have something for everyone." "Well, technically it's Hope's birthday gift, but—" He nodded to one of the staff members, who unveiled a large covered frame. Sarah gasped when the cloth fell away. There, professionally preserved and framed, was the family tree quilt she had started in the hospital a year ago. But it had been completed in secret, with new additions that made her eyes fill with tears. The quilt now included Hope and James, their names surrounded by tiny symbols, books and computers, showing their dual heritage. But what truly caught Sarah's eye was the central piece. A photograph of James Sr. had been carefully printed onto fabric and integrated into the design, watching over all of them with his gentle smile. "Michael," she whispered, "how did you—" "Claire found a specialist in photo-to-fabric printing," he explained, shifting James to his other hip. "And Dad's letter, I had it transcribed onto some of the border pieces. See?" He pointed to the elegant script winding around the edges. "Love sets us free, and true love doesn't imprison. It liberates." David adjusted his glasses, studying the intricate work. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary, though I'm particularly fond of this section." He pointed to where someone had embroidered a tiny graduation cap next to his name, along with the words, "Professor of Love Stories." "That was my addition," Claire admitted with a laugh. It seemed fitting. Hope chose that moment to reach for the quilt, her tiny fingers grazing the fabric that told her family's story. "Dada," she said clearly, pointing at David's name, then turned to Michael. "Baba." It was a new development, this ability to identify her father and brother, and it never failed to make both men emotional. Michael remembered how strange those titles had felt at first. Him being Baba while David was Dada, but now they seemed as natural as breathing. Sarah stood, balancing Hope on her hip as she traced the quilt's patterns. "It's perfect," she said softly. "Our whole story, woven together." "Not the whole story," David corrected, wrapping an arm around her waist. "We're still writing it, every day." He pulled out a small, wrapped package from his jacket pocket. "Which reminds me, Hope's other gift came in today." Sarah helped Hope unwrap the package, revealing a handmade book. On the cover was written, "The Thompson-Anderson Family Tales, Volume 1. "I had my students help with the illustrations," David explained as they flipped through the pages. "It's all our stories. How Michael built his company from love for his family. How Sarah's strength held everyone together. How Claire brought new life and wisdom. And how Hope. He tickled his daughter's chin, making her giggle. How Hope lived up to her name and brought healing to us all. Michael watched as his mother and stepfather showed Hope the pictures, pointing out family members and tea, sharing memories. Claire had settled on a nearby bench to nurse James, her face peaceful in the gathering dusk. The garden was alive with love and laughter, so different from the echoing emptiness of a year ago. His father's watch caught the light of the setting sun, and Michael smiled, remembering James's words about making every second count. He understood now that counting seconds wasn't about achievement or empire building. It was about moments like these, about family and love and the quiet miracle of belonging. Ba. Michael handed James to Claire and joined his sister and parents on the garden bench. As David began reading the family story in his rich professor's voice, Michael felt the last pieces of his heart shift into place. Success, he realized, wasn't measured in the heights of buildings or the size of bank accounts. It was measured in the strength of family bonds, in the healing of old wounds, in the creation of new stories to be passed down through generations. The fairy lights twinkled overhead as darkness fell, but the garden glowed with its own inner light, the light of family, of love renewed, of hope fulfilled. In the distance, the Tech Vision Tower stood proud against the skyline, no longer a symbol of solitary achievement, but a testament to the power of family support and unconditional love. As Hope drifted off to sleep in Sarah's arms, the sound of soft conversation and gentle laughter filled the garden. The quilt hung on the wall, telling their story in fabric and thread, while new chapters waited to be written in the books of their hearts. The Thompson-Anderson family had come full circle, finding in each other the truths that James had known all along, that love sets us free, that family grows stronger through change, and that the greatest success story of all is the one written in the language of the heart.